Dr. Lisa, this podcast is nearly exclusively for women. And so I hear the word imposter syndrome brought up on Pretty Smart probably 30 to 40% of the interviews that I do. What exactly is imposter syndrome?
So it's not shocking that you hear it a lot because from the research, about 70% of people experience imposter syndrome over their lifetime. So it's a really common experience. And it's the experience when you are competent, capable, experienced, credentialed, even expert, but yet haven't internalized that. And as a result of not internalizing that, you tend to fear being found out or found that you're a fraud. And often for you, that doesn't necessarily mean being a fraud. It means making a mistake, having human issues, having a failure. All of those things can then feel like as if you're being found out to be a fraud. In order to compensate from that feeling of fraudulence, we often either overwork or self-sabotage to cope with it, and then often get ourselves caught in situations where we are chronically burnt out and feeling really run down from the experience of having to constantly overwork or overfunction to kind of prove that we belong somewhere.
That's interesting because I don't think that I would have tied it to burnout at all.
Oh, it's highly tied. And it's correlated to burnout, anxiety, depression. But I think like what it does is because it makes you feel like you're not good enough, you are constantly trying to prove that you are good enough. And often that comes from a stance of overfunctioning and overworking.
That makes a lot of sense that it affects women disproportionately then. I've always heard that imposter syndrome comes from being underrepresented in your context. So it disproportionately...
It doesn't come from that. We find in the research that privileged and disadvantaged groups actually experience it at the same rates. There's no significant differences. So that's a mythology. And actually up until about, I would say last month, I would have also said women don't experience it disproportionately from men. But a meta-analytic study came out this month that took a look at all the research that's happened in the last couple of decades and said that they do find that there is an increase for women. It doesn't mean that only women experience it, but there is a slight and significant increase for women. So yes, we do experience it. I can now say that officially. We do experience it in larger numbers, but that's based on the research, yeah.
I'm glad to hear that in a sort of twisted way because I hear women talk about it more. And that could be that men just don't want to talk about what they're feeling inside. Yeah. But also, I've always thought that it does affect women more so. So it's interesting to hear that the research validates that.
Yeah, it just recently did it this month. And I also do think like there's been an interesting research study that looked at the differences in men and women who experience imposter syndrome. And what they found was that women tended to be counterphobic. So they actually faced the thing that they feared more often when they had imposter syndrome. And as a result, got triggered to experience imposter syndrome more often, where men were more interested in mastery and getting involved in things they already felt that they were good enough. So they tended to affiliate with peers that were less competent than they were so that they could feel mastery. And so as a result, you're going to get triggered less often when you feel better than everyone. And so like it is sort of like a gendered potential way of interacting with the world that potentially creates this experience of experiencing it more.
That's fascinating. How does it show up? How do you recognize that it's happening? What signs do you notice? I think that because it's become such a buzzy term that people use it to describe a lot of different things.
I think that's captured beautifully. Yes, it's come to mean like almost a single thing, like self-doubt. It is not solely self-doubt. It is what I consider a constellation of things. So usually when people identify truly with the experience of imposter syndrome, they're experiencing a variety of things. For example, they are feeling perfectionistic and feeling like they have to do everything right to get credit for it. They are feeling the fraud experience, needing to prove themselves. They're often overvaluing others and undervaluing themselves. They tend to kind of really catastrophize mistake making and make it bigger than it needs to be. They tend to underplay achievement making and having trouble internalizing successes and saying things like, well, it wasn't completely me. It was a variety of people. So there's a variety and a constellation of things going on. And when you can identify with almost a significant amount of the constellation, I think that's when where you're experiencing imposter syndrome. It's not just self-doubt. And it isn't transient typically. Typically people have experienced it for long periods of time. Like, so if you've experienced in one situation, chances are, and never experienced it again, chances are probably it wasn't imposter syndrome. It just was discomfort, anxiety. But when you have usually the people have a significant history of experiencing this over their entire lifetimes.
So it's not something that can pop up based on your environment.
Usually it comes from childhood. So usually it's been around for a long time. And so you can recognize it from your educational experiences, from the ways you interacted with peers, the ways you interacted with authority figures. You can see it usually throughout. So oftentimes people say, oh, my boss gave me imposter syndrome. Highly unlikely. They may have triggered it. You may have felt insecure or like not good enough with them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they gave it to you. Largely, this comes from a very well-grooved early developmental pattern.
That is so interesting. So when you say early childhood, I've heard some things that say that it's from the role that our parents played in setting expectations to codependent family dynamics, actually. What's your take on how our upbringing affects us in a sort of more zoomed in way?
I think it affects us in a variety of ways. We're actually writing a whole new book about parenting and imposter syndrome, which has me thinking about this in a variety of different ways.
Interesting.
But I think that largely, to capture it in a nutshell, it is about the way our parents like see us, the way they look at us. For example, we can often get caught in very siloed roles when we have imposter syndrome. So you were either the intelligent one who things came easy to, or you were the one who was hardworking, who had to work hard for everything. So you get caught in this idea where you're seeing it in one dimension and you feel like, people don't really know the truth about me, and that you're hiding some part of yourself. And really what you're experiencing is the humanity of what it means to be you, but people have not seen you in that full, whole way. So that piece can be a part of it. Codependent dynamics can really push that people-pleasing element of imposter syndrome, where you feel like in order to be seen as valuable or valued, you have to make other people happy and you can't say no. And that often comes from that codependent environment where saying no is going against the family grain. And so that can be having a narcissistic caregiver can also create it. So a caregiver where you are like an extension of them. You aren't your own person, and they see you as either fulfilling that extension or not fulfilling that extension. You're punished when you don't fulfill that extension and cut off. And so those kinds of things can kind of create it. Issues with conflict, not managing conflict well in the family can affect it. How people deal with success and wins and also failures can affect it. So all of these experiences that we're growing up with that are getting repeated over and over and over again are laying the foundation for how it appears in our adulthood.
I have been wanting to do an episode on imposter syndrome for over a year, and it was so hard to find the right guest for this topic. And I was so excited that we finally found you, because you are both research-based and anecdotally, personally tied to this topic, which I found just fascinating. You are an authority on imposter syndrome. You've written books, you've given TED Talks, and yet you deal with it personally. And I saw that you said you were totally triggered on the Today Show. What happened there?
Yeah, well, it was when you put out a book, oftentimes they ask you like, what are your media sources you want to be on? And like, what are your dream media sources? And it was one of my dream media sources for my
who doesn't want to be on the Today Show? Exactly. Of course.
Yeah. It wasn't uncommon, but I just didn't think it was going to happen. And then when they reached out to me, I kind of was like, oh my God, it's happening. And then I think like, as it was happening, I was like, oh, why me? Why did they choose me there? And because I'm in this field, I know all these other qualified people on imposter syndrome. I was like, why not them? And, why do I have a unique voice in here? And I really just started to go back to old patterns. And I think it was because I was in this moment, which can be very triggering, which I was highly visible. And I was being seen as an authority on a huge platform. And it felt really scary to make a mistake, to missay something. And it just really got me flooded. And I went back to an old place, but luckily I have worked on it so long that a lot of people said it didn't look like that because I was able to kind of both perform and feel the feelings, and so I think that, and then process the feelings. I think that's the thing when I had imposter syndrome a long time, had it more prevalently a long time ago, I couldn't process the feelings. I felt I was broken inside and that there was something deeply, deeply wrong with me. That was unfixable.
I think also one of the reasons I find you to be such an interesting narrator for this is that you've expanded the definition of what this is. Like I have read so many things that have this very, very narrow definition of what imposter syndrome is. And your work has brought in really specific and research-based examples of it that I think people can grab onto.
Yeah, it's been really important to me because I lived it myself. What I really wanted to do was help help everyday people get access to research that felt very far away and very inaccessible
Yes.
about how to get over it. Like, because it felt like, for me, it felt until I found the research, until I got my own support, I really felt like it was going to be there forever. And now I know it doesn't have to be, from my own research and my experience. And it was like, I wanted to disseminate it to as many people as I could because I knew how painful those experiences often were. And so that's been like my mission, is really helping to kind of give people accessibility to this information in a way that's super easy to use, read, build tools. Like, that's been really important to me.
Yes. And it often feels obtuse to me, and your work doesn't. You did a TED Talk about the topic called the imposter syndrome paradox. Why is it a paradox? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, because oftentimes when you talk about imposter syndrome, people get offended. They're like, I'm not an imposter. You're calling someone an imposter. It means you're not an imposter. There's actually a word for people who are imposters. There's a term for it. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And that's when people aren't experts, but they believe that they are.
Ooh.
And so there's a whole nother word for that. So you are not an imposter. Likely, if you experience this, I would say 9.9 times out of 10, you are not an imposter at all. You've just set a standard that is unrealistic to reach. And part of learning how to kind of move from it is being able to, understand that you can be expert, competent, and make mistakes and be human and flub. And I think that's what I also think has been really important to me as someone who speaks about this, is to recognize my own mistakes, to recognize my own humanity, to talk about like what it feels like for me to be inside of it. So that I'm not talking from on high. I actually have lived it.
Yeah.
And my TED Talk really talked about one of the most vulnerable moments of my career where imposter syndrome was at its height. I remember feeling embarrassed when I would talk to my family about what was going on at work. And I would feel embarrassed about the way that they responded to me. And they were trying to be helpful, but they were just like, what is wrong with you? Like, why can't you leave this terrible situation? And I just didn't feel like I deserved better. And, so it was really important for me in the TED Talk to share that experience, because I know a lot of people have had really what feels like super shameful experiences related to this. And I wanted to help people be able to talk about them.
If I can sort of expand on that moment, basically you were talking about a toxic work environment.
Yeah.
And part of, I think, what I felt from you was that you have this Ivy League education, you hold a doctorate, and there was this notable quote from your husband at the time where he said, if you worked as hard for yourself as you do for other people, you'd be unstoppable. And so everyone around you was telling you how capable you were, how smart you were. And can you explain why that just didn't help?
Yeah, because I didn't believe it. I believed it was all a mistake. Like, I believe I got led into my at the time, I believed I got led into my doctoral program as an accident. I actually even said that the first day I was there.
Yeah.
And my mentor said to me, I was coming out of the room after a day of orientation on the first day. And in doctoral programs, you're like one of 5 students. And so I came out and I was like, everyone was older than me, some of them had already had multiple master's degrees. And I came out and I said to my mentor, he said, how do you feel after the first day? I said, I feel like I don't belong here. Like, it's been a mistake. And he's like, well, I guess we're about to find out. And
Wow.
So he didn't say it's not a mistake. He said, like, we're about to find out if it was a mistake. So then it made me think, well, then it could have been a mistake, because he was part of the committee. So it really just like created, then I started overwork and overfunction. But I think that's the reason I never believed any of it belonged to me. And I think that's been the process I've had to go through, is really beginning to accept and take in my credibility, my experience, my expertise. Like, I think you saying, earlier that I'm an expert in the field, like, it used to make me anxious. It used to make me feel like that's not right, really. And now I can hold it. And so I think it really took my own work on being able to internalize the things that had led me to those successes. But it took a while.
Here's where I feel confused personally. I feel like I go in and out of this. There are moments where I feel really confident, and there are moments where, similar to what you just said, if I'm a guest on a podcast and someone reads this really beautiful sort of glowing intro, I want to hide under my sheets. Like I am like, oh my God. And I get really sort of humble and meek almost.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if it's tied to self-worth.
Yes, there is a direct correlation to self-worth and imposter syndrome. And I think that feeling of coming in and out is
Mm-hmm.
going to always be there, right? Like
Yeah.
you can see, I'm quote unquote an expert in the field and been in a lot of therapy and, been a therapist. I'm a therapist myself and I still come in and out of it. The
Wow.
difference today is that I know I can get out of it. In the past, I thought it was me. Like I thought, this is who I am. I'm actually an imposter and I faked this. And now I have to prove something that I'm not. I don't believe that anymore. I know that I
Mm-hmm.
am capable and I sometimes have to kind of deal with that residual feeling that comes up, but I know how to deal with it and I know how to get it back down in a pretty expedient way. And I think
Yes.
that's the difference is like people ask me all the time, like, does it ever go away? And I don't know. It doesn't really, but the volume goes down on it. Like where before it could shatter an experience. Like I had an experience early on and was doing one of my first podcasts and I got freaked out in the podcast and almost went blank. And that's how it can actually affect your performance and actually affect whether or
Interesting.
not you're going to be an expert is like really affecting you so badly that you do start to underperform. And I think that's what it makes me think about when you're talking about your story is like you're minimizing yourself and you're like trying to be humble and you're downplaying yourself in order to kind of set expectations about how fabulous you're going to be instead of standing in that fabulousness, And I
Oh
think
my
that's what
goodness.
I'm trying to kind of help people do is stand in their fabulousness. It's already there. There's nothing to do.
Yes. It's I recently had this revelation about the difference between self-confidence and self-worth. Because I've always felt like I was a confident kid. I feel like a confident person. And so I kind of ignored the conversations about self-worth. And they are totally different.
They are
And
totally different.
I have a self-worth issue. And so um, I just noticed it a few weeks ago, to be honest. It's interesting that we're having this conversation now.
Yeah.
Um, but I do find, and it could be that I'm just talking to more women, which is very possible. I do find this to be more prevalent in successful women, women in general, but definitely career women. Is there any data or research to back that up?
From my experience, and this is not from the data, there has actually been no studies to look at this but from my experience in practicing for 15 years and looking at this topic all the time and
Yeah.
experiencing it through different people's lives, there's two different cycles in imposter syndrome. The first one is the overwork cycle. So when you get triggered around your performance anxiety, you're not good enough, you overwork and overfunction. I think those are the women who probably become the super successful, super driven, and the second cycle is self-sabotage. And I think there's a lot of people who experience imposter syndrome who actually do fail because they set themselves up in a self-sabotage cycle through the performance anxiety. And so I have met many a
Wow.
person who hasn't lived up to their quote unquote potential or the things that they wanted to do because they have to break the self-sabotage behaviors that they have associated with imposter syndrome. So I think there's a whole subset of people who haven't gotten to where they wanted to because of it.
What is self sabotage? Because what does that look like? I think of self sabotage like um, sort of, I guess, the more extreme ideas of it,
Yeah.
like, having an issue with alcohol or not showing up on time. What are sort of the implicit ways that we self sabotage?
Yeah, so I think the most classic way is like procrastination followed by intense bursts of overwork. So oftentimes, because we are capable and competent, we're going to try to get it done. But sometimes those intense bursts of work to get the thing done, and sometimes they aren't enough because you did
Mm-hmm.
need that longer period of time to deal with it. So in those cases, you can often fall short or not. And then that sort of becomes a reinforcing notion that, yes, I am a fraud, I don't belong here. Meanwhile, it's
Wow.
really the self-sabotage issue that becomes the issue itself. And even if you look at my own story, as I'm talking about the toxic boss, and I am not doing anything proactive for my search in the story. I am just like sitting around complaining I was miserable, so I have a right to complain, but I wasn't doing anything to serve myself to move forward. And so nothing was changing. And so as a result, there is a possibility that, I think about my life as it diverged in that moment. And there was a possibility I could have stayed there for years. And then I would have underfunctioned in terms
Mm-hmm.
of my capability. I would have been stuck in a job, I would have been underpaid. There's a lot of stories like this where people are underfunctioning, underpaid, because they can't help themselves in the ways that they want to, because they can't break that self-sabotage cycle. So you could talk about it for years, probably.
Yeah. I was interested to see that you wrote that imposter syndrome isn't just work related.
Mm-hmm.
I have only thought about it in terms of work. How else does it show up? How does it show up in our personal lives?
Yeah, because imposter syndrome has such a performance related component to it, right? You don't feel like you're performing at whatever level. It's true of like anytime you feel like you are, engaged in something that's being, potentially evaluated, or that it matters in some dynamic where there's some other person involved. So I've seen it in people's parenting. I've seen it in people's like relationships. So because of all the other dynamics, right? Because there's issues around codependence and there's issues around over functioning. All of these dynamics often show up in other parts of their lives. And what I found, interestingly enough, in my clinical work, as I work with people on imposter syndrome and eradicating it, we focus mostly in the beginning on work. And so we deal with it and we get through sort of like in my book, the 9 steps and everything. And they begin to feel like they're releasing themselves from imposter syndrome. And then they sort of start to look at their personal life and they're like, oh my God, it's here too. And then they start to do the work around their personal lives and disentangling it from their personal lives as well, which can be also really freeing, but also really scary.
Yeah.
Because work is like, we can change workplaces. It's really harder to change personal lives. That work is a lot deeper.
Do you think it presents in romantic relationships?
Oh, most certainly. The idea of over functioning, the idea of not feeling good enough in the relationship, the feeling that, you're going to be left. Because I think a lot of people worry, when they're have imposter syndrome about being fired. It's like, it's the same concept in a relationship of being left. They're like, I have to work hard because, they're cutting people and I'll be the one who's cut if I don't, and the same kind of like a frenzy can be in a relationship as well.
Is that if we're talking about sort of the archetypes, that's maybe more for the anxious people?
Yeah, anxious, codependent, people pleasing, those kinds of dynamics that are occurring in the imposter syndrome just replicate in personal, because you developed this in the first place from a personal relationship. This came from your early experiences. So the fact that it would still be there makes complete sense.
I've definitely experienced that in romantic relationships and wasn't aware. I was aware that I was doing it, but I was unaware of where it was coming from. And I had a therapist who said something that sort of feels close to what you're saying, which is this feeling might never go away, but just noticing it will help you ease whatever is happening. And the noticing is what I think is so important here.
Yes. I think that's critically important. So the awareness can lead to behavior change, right? Because if you see it, you then feel like, do I really want to do that next behavior again? Like, might there be something different that I might do this time that actually might be healthier or helpful for me? And so I do think that's the fundamental piece I'm really trying to promote with people, is really getting an education into the idea of it, what it really is. And if you do struggle with it, thinking about being aware in a way that just changes even one thing.
So I saw you post on Instagram some imposter syndrome self-love languages, which I loved reading about. And the reason I loved reading about it was it made me feel like this is not all doom and gloom. There are ways, like you said, to notice it, to maybe not heal it, but make it settle more so. What are some tactical things that we can do to show ourselves a little love when we are feeling it, when we do notice it?
Yeah, so I think like one of the things is really learning how to recognize that compliments are relational, and that, when somebody gives you a compliment, they're actually trying to extend and connect with you, and to really receive that back without trying to dismiss it or qualify it or make them, disconnect from you. Because it's a disconnection when you're like, well, because then they're feeling like, oh God, maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. Maybe so I think it's really important to just accept it. And I think really take it in and thank them. And what I often tell people is like, actually jot it down. Maybe you can't hear it right now, but maybe you want to actually jot it down and write it down, put it somewhere for you to read later. Because part of that is really working on, and one of the factors in terms of developing self-esteem is really being able to take in other people's perceptions of your work or the things that you're doing. And so without doing that, you're missing this element of self-esteem building that you're getting. So it is a love language that we really reject, but we have to work on accepting. And I do also think the other pieces of sort of the things that we can do are really also appreciating a small win, really being able to not have to have some mind-blowing win in order to feel like you can celebrate yourself, but even the tiny wins, even the wins that are fraught with mistakes and issues and all of those things, being able to celebrate those as well. And I think also for me, like there's another love language that I learned along the way, which is setting boundaries. Like I was always afraid of setting boundaries and feeling like if I set a boundary, someone wouldn't like me or love me anymore. And to be honest, the people who love me the most accept my boundaries and respect my boundaries. And so it's brought me all kinds of better relationships in my life.
So you gave us 3 great ones. Thank you for that. I think I've been calling this imposter syndrome because that's what we know it as colloquially, but you call it an imposter phenomenon. So
Yes,
from here on out, I'm rebranding. We're calling it imposter phenomenon. Why is it a phenomenon?
Because it's a common occurrence, right? It's not and I think that's how it was originally termed by Clance and Imes in like 1978 when they did the original paper that began to talk about this. And it's received a lot of criticism, but I think people really don't put it in context and really recognize that this was a very important finding in the 1970s that really began a conversation around how do we shift this, right? And I think that's so important. And they wanted to suggest it's not a diagnosis. You can't find it in the DSM. You can't find it in the ICD, which are diagnostic manuals. It is, something that is super common and can be experienced and also can be changed. And so I think like it's a really important distinction. I often say syndrome because nobody knows it as phenomenon. In the academic literature, if you're searching academic literature, it's always known as phenomenon.
Interesting.
It's never known as syndrome. Yeah. So I actually just was part of an academic book that came out by the American Psychological Association. So if people are interested in this in an academic way, this amazing book came out in the spring called The Imposter Phenomenon. It was edited by Kevin Coakley, who is one of the leading researchers in imposter phenomenon today. And it's all these chapters about all these really interesting ways in which imposter phenomenon appears in different arenas, formats, things you just need to consider. There's a whole chapter on medicine and the ways it shows up in medicine. And so it talks about the most recent research, and it's called The Imposter Phenomenon. It talks about these most recent research articles. So it's really blossoming, and I hope it continues. There's been a lot of backlash around it, sort of suggesting that you're like oppressing people by telling them they have it. And in my 15 years of doing this work, whether directly doing it or indirectly doing this imposter phenomenon work, I haven't seen a single person who felt oppressed by hearing this conversation. In essence, they felt empowered to go do something about it. Oftentimes the people who told them that they might be experiencing really cared about them and wanted to see them just take in their full greatness and weren't seeing them do that. And so like, I think that narrative needs to shift. That narrative is deeply disturbing to me, that this is not something we need to be talking about and that it's oppressive. There is no research that suggests that. It's just become a clickbait kind of social conversation that I think is really dangerous, frankly.
I agree. Information always feels validating because otherwise you think that it's outside of you, that it's out of your control. It's just something, like you said, that you have to live with for your whole life.
Yeah. And I've seen people, I've, done talks, and people have come up to me and said that they have told people that they experience imposter syndrome. And then they've said that somebody said to them, it doesn't exist. And they felt so shamed, and they felt like they had to go back into hiding around it. And so I think that's what that conversation is doing, is shaming people who feel like this, which feels deeply disturbing to me.
Yes. Well said. We talked a bit about gender, and I learned from our conversation that it's less about context and environment than I anticipated it was, that it's more from childhood. Yeah. But when you talk about these symptoms or the way that it shows up, and you talk about overwork and overperform, I can't help but think of how that disproportionately affects anybody in a minority group at work.
Yeah.
What's the link or the tie there?
Yeah, so we call it the double impact of imposter syndrome. So it's this experience when, for people who are marginalized and experience like imposter syndrome internally, like I'm not good enough, I don't belong here, and then get external communications from the environment that are discriminatory or biased that say, yeah, maybe you don't belong here. Maybe you're not good enough. Maybe you got in here because of a diversity program. Maybe you're a diversity hire. These kinds of messages then reinforce imposter syndrome and make people feel like it must be true. Now I'm receiving messages from the outside world that this is not the case, that I
Right.
don't actually belong here. And so what the research shows is that, especially for marginalized communities, that having relationships with people along the identity lines they feel most impacted are at similar levels and at senior levels becomes really important to them in helping to deal with these external communications around discrimination and bias. They need some place to process it so that they can realize this is discrimination and bias, and here's the ways to strategically deal with it, and don't take this in, because internalizing those messages becomes really then hard to dismantle the imposter syndrome, because you then feel it's coming from both directions.
That seems really difficult when there's like a lack of a pipeline.
Yes.
At
and
any organization.
Yes. Which oftentimes means you have to do it externally. Like you have to look for professional organizations externally that have, they may not have internal, but they may not understand your unique circumstance of your organization, but they often understand the dynamics. They've been there. And you want to find somebody clearly who gets it, who really is kind of mature in their own racial and ethnic identity in order to kind of or sexual identity, to be able to kind of recognize bias. Because somebody might also gaslight you and say that that's not what happens and everyone gets it from merit. And if that's the case, they're not the right person to support you in this. They have to
My mind's sort of spinning hearing you say this, because I did a morning show in Chicago a few years ago, and it was the first time that I had another female co-host. I'd always had male co-hosts, and talking to her was the most validating experience I had ever had in my industry, because she made me feel like I wasn't complaining, I wasn't crazy, that she also had these feelings. And so she wasn't my senior, she was my peer, but even talking it through with her was just so helpful and relaxing.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, Danielle. It becomes really critically important for you to not feel crazy, to feel like these are real experiences, but they don't belong to you. You do not need to internalize them or even combat them like in a way that makes you overfunction or overwork. Like you can actually just know that they exist and feel like, how am I going to handle this? Like I know it exists in the world, and this is my particular work world. How am I going to strategically deal with it?
Yeah. One of the reasons I started Pretty Smart was when I was going through probably the most difficult time in my life. Nothing made me feel better. I mean, I was doing therapy, I was working out, I was trying all the things. And the one thing that gave me any sort of reprieve was reading or hearing other women's stories. And it brings me to that validation aspect that you're talking about throughout all of this. And so when I think about this podcast, fundamentally, it's about sharing women's stories. And imposter syndrome fundamentally is about how we perceive ourselves and how we recall these stories that we tell ourselves.
Beautifully put, Danielle. I love that so much. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
From your experience with this, is there a way that we can step back and determine what is real versus what is the story we are telling ourselves in our heads?
Yeah, we talk about that in book 1, really about sort of how to recognize like things like automatic negative thoughts that may be coming up and being triggered for you to think, like I'm not good enough, I don't belong here. And really recognizing that part of your job with an automatic negative thought is to challenge it. So that, there's a quote that says, you are not your thoughts, you are the observer of your thoughts, by Amit Ray. And I really am trying to train people to, this is a very cognitive behavioral like technique that works very well with imposter syndrome to really help you recognize, like, where did that thought come from? Where's the data behind that thought? You make a mistake and you're like, I'm so stupid. Like, where's the evidence that you're stupid? Like, if you can't find it, you can't say it, so it just can't be the fact that you're labeling yourself without some kind of data or proof. And ask other people, is that the way you see me? Do you see me as, and say the words, do you see me as stupid? Like, say the words, and sometimes coming out of your mouth, you can recognize like, this is going on in my head, but when I say it out loud, it feels not great. And so like, I think that can help you to kind of really think about, then why is that part of my story? And
Yeah.
then thinking about re-narrating that story. And we talk about that too, about these narrative approaches in the book around like how to really rethink the way you think about your successes, your accomplishments, the things that you're doing, and the ways that you represent them to yourself and to others, and to
Hmm.
watch the way that languaging is happening. Because I do think that the story you tell yourself is a very, very important story to the way that you show up in the world and the things you think you can and can't do. And so it makes total sense that when I've seen that actually with my clients too. They can be in the middle of a really desperate, anxiety spiral, and they'll watch on YouTube people talking about anxiety, like, and they just kind of fall into this like place where they feel comforted by the stories because they feel like other people have experienced it too, and I'm not alone.
Yeah.
And so I do think like, that's really important to find that camaraderie, and also to begin to recognize that you can tell different stories. Like you can still be struggling and still tell a different story about, that struggle.
Dr. Lisa, I love the idea of asking people around you that you trust, is this how you see me?
Yeah.
It can be really vulnerable, but I think for me, part of what hurts about imposter syndrome is this idea that you have to face it alone in your brain.
Yeah.
And it's constantly you against your brain. And so to reach out to your community, there's something so just relaxing or easing about that.
Yeah, and it can be really scary because oftentimes you are sharing this for the first time, or and it's in limited ways. But it is such a part of like dealing with the shame of it, and
Yeah.
the difficulty of being stuck in your head and getting out of your head, and having people around you that I consider like imposter syndrome confidants, that you can actually share the deep, dark thoughts that really are embarrassing, about what's going on internally and why you're behaving in a certain way. And you want people who can actually listen and hear it and don't dismiss it and don't be like, well, why are you
Yes.
thinking that? Why are you feeling that? You just want people to hear you and validate it you. And sometimes it takes training them. You have to train them to hear you. You have to be
Oh
like,
my
I
goodness.
appreciate that thought, that I don't deserve it, but what I really need right now is just a listening ear to just hear me and just validate what I'm saying as like, you hear me, and you can support me in that, in hearing that. I'm not going to stay here forever, but I need to be here right now.
Listening to hear and understand versus listening to reply.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to sometimes train people to do it, because their instinct may be to protect you in a way that just makes you feel bad by
Yeah.
kind of saying, you shouldn't feel like that. It's like, should or shouldn't isn't the question here. It is, it's what I am feeling.
Right. The shoulds are the worst.
Yes.
I always do a little rapid fire. So I have a
Sure.
few for you, which is the first is, what is your proudest moment?
That's a hard one. Like what immediately came to mind was the first book. And then right after that thought came my kids, giving birth to my kids.
How old are they?
They're 12 and 14.
Amazing. If you weren't a psychologist, is there another career path you would have tried?
Would have been a hairstylist. That one's easy. I would have been a hairstylist. I tried to go to hair
You're
school
kidding.
while I was in my PhD program, but they wouldn't accept me because they said, you have to finish your PhD program first before you can go to hair school.
First of all, in both careers, everybody tells you their secrets. So I get it.
Yes. It was actually quite a lot of synergy, but didn't happen.
Someone sits in a chair and tells you their secrets. Okay, something that you're not ashamed to admit you're not so great at.
I'm not very great with my hands. I have terrible handwriting. And I'm very sloppy of a handwriter. So I remember like people saying like I had a handwriting of a doctor, but not in their class. I couldn't write like that in their class, but I have
Oh my God, you do have
handwriting.
doctor in front of your name. It's okay.
Yeah, now I do.
Yeah. Okay, what's something you're great at that we wouldn't know?
I love crochet. I crochet a lot. And I love to crochet. It's like one of my favorite things that I do on the side. I just love it so much.
That's super cool. Is there a book that you've read that you think everybody should read? Something that really impacted you?
I think I would say The First 90 Days.
Okay.
It's a very good book about like, how to approach kind of entering into a workplace proactively and thinking about not only doing your job well, but also the the resources around you to kind of do your job well. So I think that's a really strategic book to kind of connect to.
That's a great book. Starting at a new job is just one of the worst feelings ever.
And it can be very triggering for imposter syndrome. New job, new role can be like some of the common triggers. So that book is a really good practical advice giving book about what you should be doing besides like just doing your job well and like focusing on being a hard worker. There's a lot of other components that are very vital to thriving.
Thank you for that. Okay, I do a pretty smart question. So you let me know when to stop.
Stop.
Okay, well, this is a hard one.
Oh no.
What do you know for sure?
Oh, I know for sure that love is the most important thing about life and like building the people that you love around you. And you know, I think giving love to the world in a lot of ways is really important. And so like, you know, these books are like my love letter to the world. So I think like that's the most important thing I always think about is love, you know.
Amazing. My last question is, what's the smartest decision you've ever made?
Marrying my husband.
That was easy.
The best. I mean, he just brought like wonder and possibility and risk and like all these really fun things I was never really comfortable with into my life. You know, he's really just opened the world.
It's amazing and beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.